So let's walk into the square a little bit more. So we're going to be outside St Giles Cathedral. And a lot of people, when they come to Edinburgh, ask what these barriers are here for. Well, during the Edinburgh Festival, it gets really crowded in this particular square. So this is to manage the flow of the traffic of the crowds, because in the heart of the Edinburgh Festival, you can hardly move, because this is where a lot of the performers will come and do street performing. And so in order to manage the crowds, these barriers are quite essential. And to stop the traffic, because there's no traffic allowed here during the festival period, so it's also to stop the traffic coming out. Maybe Mike can swing around and get a good view of the High Court of Justiciary.
Yeah, that's a favourite place for pipers to play. I will tell you that I used to play the bagpipes in front of that door, but you're not allowed to do it at weekdays when the court is sitting.
Which makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense, yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if you've ever done this, Mike. I have done it during these periods when you've got really nothing to do. It's maybe in the middle of winter and you're looking for something to do. Go in here, because the courts are open and you can sit and watch some of the big trials going on. I think it'd be quite entertaining as well.
Yeah.
It's free.
It's one of these niche things that you never think of. Yeah.
What did they used to call them in France when the tricoteuses, when they used to watch during the French Revolution? You had these people who would sit and knit while they're watching the show trials going on and watching the people being beheaded, and they would sit and knit. They call them the tricoteuses, the knitters.
Yeah.
So moving on a wee bit, if you remember last week when we were up in Swanston, we talked about the water supply coming into Edinburgh. Well, here we've got one of the wellheads here. So this is where the public would come and gather the fresh water that has been piped in. And if you remember, it was coming in from the Pentland Hills. It was coming in through gravity, because the Pentland Hills are higher than, although we're high up on Castle Hill, the Pentlands are higher up, and just purely through gravity, the water would come through, and it's gone back to the 1600s, I believe. And this is where people would get all of their information, this is where all the gossip, you would find out all what's happening in the town. So this would be your social media of the 17th century, social media.
Gathering spot, yeah. I'd like to also point out, if I haven't noticed, viewers, we've got a COP26 happening in Glasgow, still happening just now. And if you're American, you might be interested to know that one of your former presidents is coming this week, Barack Obama.
He arrived today.
Yeah, there you go, he's
today.
here today. And so we are commemorating that. Although we're Edinburgh, you can see the banner there to do with COP26. Yeah.
I know that the guys from CNN got into big trouble. Wolf Blitzer, commentator for CNN, because he was broadcasting from Edinburgh, and he said, I'm here at the COP26 in Glasgow, and people were going like, he had the view of Edinburgh Castle behind him, and people were going to say, Wolf, I hate to tell you this, but you're actually in Edinburgh. You're 50 miles away from where all the action is. So the CNN had to put a retraction to say, yeah, well, we're accommodated here in Edinburgh, but they were actually, they're just conflating the two cities, but, never mix Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's a healthy rivalry between the two cities.
I've been told too that when President Biden met Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister of Scotland, he gave her a present for Scotland. And as yet, I do not know, and many people do not know what that is. So they seem to get on quite well. They met in Kelvin Grove Art Gallery Museum, where Joe and I are going to be. We're looking at covering that in the future, that venue, aren't we?
Yeah. And Kelvin Grove was where they had the big gala. They had Prince of Wales there, Prince Charles there, and I think the other royals were there.
I think, the Duke of Cambridge.
Duke of Cambridge was there.
Well.
So that was where they had the big gala dinner on the first evening. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping to take you, certainly we'll be outside it, but we are working to get inside the gallery, so I'll have to do an indoors walk around the gallery. Yeah. So, as I mentioned last week, we have a few irons in the fire for over the winter to share some of the treasures of Scotland with you. So, bear with us.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that last week went down to London with the family and had a great time. Went to see the musical Hamilton, and I'd heard great things about it. And of course, it was a full house. Lucky to get tickets, and what a show that was! Really enjoyed it. Fantastic.
And isn't it great? You can just jump on the train. And you took the overnight, didn't you?
We took the Caledonian Sleeper, where you hop on about 11:40 and you arrive in London Euston about 7 o'clock in the morning. and we had what was called, I think, the club class going down, which meant that you had your ensuite and you had your double bunk and you had all the necessaries. So a good way to travel, and quite soothing, I felt, the motion of the train as well.
And it's ecological as well.
Yeah.
As opposed to our Prime Minister who left COP last week, jumped on a private plane for a dinner in London after being greenwashing up in Glasgow. Don't get me started on that one.
Yes.
more about our Prime Minister later. I've got something in the bag for him.
Are you going to talk about this, Joe?
So this is a statue of the Duke of Buccleuch. Who was he? Well, let's say he came from a very good, very established family. In the early 1800s, when George IV visited here, he was the first monarch to visit for how many years? I think, well, since...
It's over 170 years.
Yeah, since unification of the countries. He was the first king, British king, to come back up to Scotland since unification. Maybe Charles II came here before, but certainly came up here. And when he arrived here, the Palace of Holyrood was uninhabitable at the time, so it was the Duke of Buccleuch who gave up his palace in Dalkeith. So George IV stayed there.
A bit of a backstory, Joe. I think it's called Walter Francis Scott was his actual name.
Yep.
And not to be confused with Sir Walter Scott. And Sir Walter Scott was his mentor who looked after him because he succeeded to the title only age 13, I believe. So that must have been quite
because his brother died. His older brother had died, so he inherited the title.
Yeah.
And so you see him up here in all his glory. Very, very wealthy man. He built the. He was quite an industrial entrepreneur in many regards. So he did build the port down at Granton, which allowed the transfer of goods across to the north, and also he built the rail tracks to come up and down from Granton up to here as well. So he was very good at developing it, and also they made the money. Let's not hide it here. He made a lot of money out of coal, so he also made a lot of money out of plantations as well. So who didn't in those days? Certainly.
Agricultural improvement as well.
He had
a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
But there's two sides too, because there's a darker side that people think about the huge land ownership that these individuals had, and today the Duke of Buccleuch still is a figure who holds lots of land, and they talk about him being loved by the people who stayed on his land. So it was this kind of feudal relationship, but at the same time he was a popular individual, I believe.
And the current, we talked before in one of our tours about the company of archers, and the Duke of Buccleuch is the head of the company, the current Duke of Buccleuch, and so was he. He was head of the archers, the Royal Company of Archers, who are the Queen's bodyguards, or the Monarch's bodyguards when they're here in Scotland. Now around the plaques, you go around the plaques here, everyone tells a story about the life and times of the family, of the Scott family, the Douglas Scott family. And each one tells a story. There's one here. I think this is Queen Elizabeth, the first here.
Yeah.
So being presented.
I think around the bottom panels are the older history of his family, and the ones further up, I think, are maybe some of the more recent.
His own life.
His own life, yeah.
So they've got the individual life with the panels up the top. You can see there's an industrial one here, just right here. As you see these are the industrialists getting together discussing the development of projects in Edinburgh up the top here.
Yeah, and also, interestingly enough, he's dressed in the Order of the Garter, which is it's British or English form of knighthood, honorary title, but also the statue was designed separately to the plinth, and when they came to position it, they discovered that the statue was far too big for the plinth.
So his feet are stepping over.
And maybe if you can see that, it just looks as if he's just about to step off it.
Well, if you come around this side, you'll see the foot coming over the edge.
There it is.
So it looks like he's stepping off.
Yeah, and I believe he met Queen Victoria at an early point in her reign, and I think around here, if we can find the one further up, I think it's here. Yeah, here it is. This is, I believe, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who would have been arriving down at Granton
Yeah, that's right.
And they were being taken in their coach and accompanied by the Duke of Buccleuch. Maybe you can see the coach there.
And the relief.
Yeah.
So it was his harbour that they actually arrived.
Yeah.
But this whole square just tells you the whole. I mean, every part of the square that you're in is reflected on something that happened in the history of Scotland. I mean, this is probably one of the most historic squares in the whole of Scotland itself. And we'll take a wee walk around and maybe bring out some of the events and characters.
I've had a comment saying, "Don't go touching that toe." For good luck.
If I could climb on the first step, I would be doing well. Give me a few more weeks and I'll see if I can step up on a few steps there. But yeah, it does look like he's like coming over the edge here. Let's walk a wee bit further up here.
A little bit. How you doing, Joey? How's your leg?
It's bearing up.
Is it good?
Hiya.
Right. Yeah. And we've got to talk about this, haven't we? We've got to talk about the heart of Midlothian.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So here in the middle of the square here, we have the heart of Midlothian. Now, in modern parlance, the heart of Midlothian is one of the football teams based here in Edinburgh called the Heart of Midlothian. The other team is called Hibernia. So there's two big football teams here. There's also the book, The Heart of Midlothian, written by Walter Scott, which is a great book, and I would recommend to read it. But the Heart of Midlothian was also the prison that was here. It was a prison that was right outside the cathedral. And so it's a place where a lot of people were held in prison before their execution or even before their trial. And there is a tradition here, again, another tradition here in Edinburgh, and done by the locals. And because a lot of the trials that took place here were trials of patriots and people who were against the rule of law or the establishment, they were fighting for civil rights and fighting for national rights, were held here. They were either transported to Australia or they were executed for their proposed crimes. So the tradition here in Edinburgh is that in this heart of Midlothian, and Mike maybe can point out, see the part itself in the shaped into the cobblestones here. You see the heart. So the tradition is, the locals, that you're supposed to walk past here. You never walk across it. You walk to the side of it, and you're supposed to spit right into the middle of the heart of Midlothian as a sign of disrespect of authority. People always say that. People always say that the Scots have a healthy disregard for authority.
And today, you know, Joe, I'm thinking we complain about the rain, but the rain and the water have picked up the colours of that heart of Midlothian, and they make things in Scotland much more vivid than in dry weather.
Yeah.
And even going up north. And I think one of our landscape painters who I talked about before, Mealy, Sir John Everett Mealy, used to comment how he loved to go to a scene after it had been raining, because all the colours came up so nicely. And I think that applies to this. Yeah.
Especially in the autumnal light we get here as well.
Yeah.
So maybe if we take a look across the other side of the square here, Mike, you can see this building here. This used to be the chambers for the Lothian Regional Council. This building here, the sand colour building. This is now the French Institute. France and Scotland have a long history together. It's supposed to be the oldest diplomatic alliance in Europe, la vieille alliance entre l'Écosse et la France. So the old alliance between France and Scotland. Of course, Scotland, the monarchy, had a very, very close relationship. Mary Queen of Scots grew up in France. Her mother, Marie de Guise, was Queen Regent here for about 20 years while young Mary was over in France. So there's a few of the kings had married into the French royal family. James V had married Marie de Guise. So we had a very, very close relationship with France. And here we have the French Institute and the French consulate here, right in the middle of the square.
And many Scots, well-educated Scots, spoke French as well, didn't they?
Well, to get into the better universities in Scotland, you had to have a foreign language. So French was taught very early in our schools. I mean, I studied science at Edinburgh University, but in order to get into Edinburgh, you had to have an O level at least in French. So you had to have a second language. And so most of the Glasgow, Edinburgh, most of the ancient universities required that you had to have a foreign language. I'm
thinking of Outlander as well, where the part of the story goes to France, and you just have this feeling of a very strong connection.
There is indeed a lot of the, even you go back to the period of the Enlightenment, there was a lot of exchange and ideas, because a lot of the revolutionary ideas were coming out of France at the time. So there was always a fear from the British establishment that these revolutionary ideas would transfer over here. And a lot of them were picked up. So we did have, although we went to war with France on many occasions, a lot of the revolutionary ideas did come here, and a lot of Scottish patriots were deported or transported from here to Australia because of the revolutionary ideas that they were trying to... we've already covered the Martyrs Monument down in the other cemetery. So these ideas were quick to get across, and the exchange of French and English between the Scots was quite common.
Yeah, because you think the rivalry between Scotland and England and the wars of independence between Scotland and England, but then it was nothing like the rivalry and friction that England had with France.
Yeah.
There was, just went on and on.
My enemy's enemy is my friend. But if we spin around now, we'll get St Giles, St Gilles, again another French connection here. St Giles, he was a patron saint of lepers, and he lived down in the south of France, down in the area of Montpellier, that area. It's a nice little story. He had a pet deer, and he loved this little deer. And one day they were out in the fields, and the huntsmen were chasing deer, and they saw his pet deer, and they fired an arrow to try and kill the deer. And St Giles stood in front of the arrow, and he took the arrow in the leg. So when you see a picture of St Giles, you'll see a big wound on his leg where the arrow went in.
Well, you can see if we're moving, and here I go again about the water on the architecture, because I think it picks it up even more distinctly at the moment. You can see and delineate it. So we've got a little tour passing at the moment, so we'll try and move on quickly or quietly. And Joe was talking about St Giles, and we've got this relief above the door, and there you can see the deer, and you can see the arrow through the hand of St Giles.
Protecting his little fawn.
Yeah.
He was a hermit, and I say he was a patron saint of lepers, and he was also the patron saint of Edinburgh.
That's right. And you've got personalities, haven't you? You've got these figures, and on the bottom, I think, have we got the clergy, we've got the religious figures, and I think it tells you who they are. We've got John Knox on the right here, and we've got Gavin Douglas here, Cardinal maybe?
Yeah, he would have been a bishop.
Yeah, bishop, and we'll move further on. And above them are the monarchs, but I don't think we're going to go way up there.
No. But the church itself was established in the 1100s under King David I, the original church. But parts of this church go back to the 14th century, Mike, is it?
Yes, and in fact they did a bit of research too, and apparently the structure inside the crown spire we used to think was 16th century, but recent research has dated it to be 15th century. So there is a lot of very old architecture.
Now, we call it St Giles Cathedral, but technically it's known as a High Kirk, because this church preceded the Reformation. So we had the Reformation, where it was, prior to that it was a Catholic church and then became Protestant. Not a lot of the churches survived the Reformation, but this church did. So it went from being a cathedral to the High Kirk. Kirk is just a Scottish word for church. So Kirk, when we refer to the Kirk, we generally refer to the Church of Scotland itself. So this is the High Kirk.
And unusually so, this is built on I must get this the right way around, a Greek cross rather than a Latin cross. Whereas the Latin cross, where the crucifix is more like the cross on which we think Jesus was crucified on, whereas the Greek cross is more symmetrical in its arms, if that's right, So the high altar is in the centre of the church as opposed to being right down at the choir or in the chancel here.
And if you're visiting Edinburgh, it's open to the public. You can go inside it. It is a beautiful place to go in. I've actually been to concerts in here. A few years ago I went to a play in here, and the play was The Murder in the Cathedral.
Yeah. Ideal setting.
And while the play was going on, a piece of masonry fell off the ceiling, so they had to abandon the play.
Oh,
yeah,
gee
the
whiz.
play had to continue outside. The show must go on, so the play continued outside. So you had to use your imagination.
So
But yeah.
forces that they don't quite understand, well, maybe at work, you never know.
Yeah, so murder in the cathedral. So we're in Parliament Square. We're going to take a wee walk around here. So this is where the old Parliament of Scotland would have sat.
And I think that's 18th century kind of building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's been lots of additions to it. The cathedral itself is a centre point here, and it's beautiful in wintertime when it's all dark out here and the lights are on inside it. It just looks particularly. The stained glass windows are particularly gorgeous in here.
It's amazing stained glass. They've got a window to Robert Burns as well.
That's right.
Which is quite unusual to have a secular figure commemorated in a stained glass in a religious setting. Yeah.
But they've also got Robert Louis Stevenson, another famed atheist.
Yes.
They've got a big, not a statue, but a relief on the wall to Robert Louis Stevenson, another great. And one of the great stories that I love here, I mean, this building has seen Scottish history. This has seen the Reformation. This has seen rebellion, revolution, everything. And one of the stories that I like was when they tried to introduce the English Episcopalian services back here, where Scotland was, had become fervently Presbyterian. They tried to introduce the Episcopalian method of celebration of religion, and people had to bring their own little stools to sit on, their own little benches to sit on. And then there was this famous one called Jenny Geddes, who did not like this bishop who was trying to bring this papist type of religion back into Scotland, so she picked up her stool and launched the stool at the head of the bishop. And so they've actually got a stool in here as a monument to Jenny Geddes, and I think that just sums up to me the Scottish mentality of, she says, I've had enough of this, picks up her own stool and just launches it at the head of the bishop, gets the bishop right on the ponce.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Porteous riots that we were talking about as well. Going back into the earlier part of the 18th century when the people just were voting with their feet. They knew that this wasn't right, that this guy, Captain Porteous, who had ordered his men to fire on the populace to keep them under control, then later they lynched him and hung him. And that is something to do with don't touch me with impunity, our national motto.
Our national
touch
motto.
Us, we'll touch you back. Sort of
Nemo me impune lacessit. Nobody touches me with impunity. And it just sums it up. People feared the Edinburgh mob. The mob were here, and when they signed the documents for the unification, the bells rang out a song, the church bells here in St Giles, "Why am I so sad on the day of my wedding?"
Yeah.
So because it wasn't a popular thing when they signed Act of Unification, it was seen as a sellout, and so the populace was rioting again, and backed up by the bells of St Giles. They said, "Why am I so unhappy on my marriage day?"
And have continued to rise and demonstrate over issues such as Scottish independence and also over opposition to Brexit. Yeah. We've had huge demonstrations up before COVID happened of the people out marching so that the politicians will listen. And I suppose in a way similar to the climate marches that have been happening in Glasgow just over the last week or so. Yeah.
Well, Mike, it was actually here in these courts when the Brexit was going on. There was a famous politician here called Joanna Cherry, and Joanna Cherry, she's a lawyer by training, and she was a member of an MP in Westminster, and she challenged through the Constitution. She took it to the highest constitutional courts, which are here. So this is again, we're still in the local areas. What we're looking at here is the old Parliament building, but they're all law courts now. And it was here that the Constitution was challenged, where our Prime Minister tried to prorogue Parliament against the Constitution, and it was challenged up here in Scotland when it was proven that he had no right to dismiss the British Parliament. He was challenged down in England at the High Court, and he was challenged up here, and on both occasions he got his butt kicked, basically.
And they were still talking about that just a couple of days ago. John Major, one of our former Prime Ministers, was talking about the illegal proroguing of Parliament, and that was against somebody from his own party.
Yeah.
So strange times,
Last week was the 5th of November. And I know a lot of people who are not British may not know what the 5th of November is. It's our firework day. It's where we have bonfires. Now, why do we have bonfires? Because back in 1605, there was a man known as Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, and he opposed, he was part of what they call the Catholic conspiracy. He opposed the Stuarts. So James VI of Scotland in 1603 became the King of Scotland and of England. He moved his whole entourage down to London. The Catholics didn't like this, first of all, the Stuarts coming in and the imposition of the Protestant faith on them. So they were conspiring with the Spanish to try and get rid of the faith. So they wanted to assassinate the king. So in the Houses of Parliament, the people could rent out space underneath the Parliament. Guy Fawkes decided that on the 5th of November they would try and blow up Parliament. So they stashed all the gunpowder underneath the place where the king was supposed to be. Of course, the plot was uncovered. Guy Fawkes was captured. Guy Fawkes was then sentenced, and his death was he was going to be burnt alive on a bonfire. And they stuffed him, various parts of him, with gunpowder so that he was actually getting blown up while it was going on. And so that's why we celebrate the 5th of November. Now, we don't celebrate the 5th of November because Parliament was blown up. We celebrate because Parliament was saved. So it wasn't because, but people do say, even nowadays, that the last person to enter the British Parliament with a good idea was Guy Fawkes.
Absolutely.
Because we're going through at the moment. And we had this shenanigans going on in our Parliament last week where there's corruption. There's blatant corruption is going on. And there's a debate going on as we are here now live. There is a debate going on in our Parliament down south about the corruption of our Prime Minister and his mob who tried to overturn the whole process of keeping a handle on corruption. They tried to basically take the lid off to make it easier, and it was just so blatant, and everybody, even people in his own party. So I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to link the 5th of November with Boris Johnson.
As they call it.
Sorry, I went in a rant there.
No.
Sleesmeister General. He's the Sleesmeister General. And the quicker he goes, I'm sorry, I don't like to get too political, but that man has just got to go. I will end my rant on our Sleesmeister General, who will not even attend Parliament today because he hasn't got the cojones to stand in front of people because he's caught out in his lies, he was caught out in shenanigans, and the man needs to go. There we go. Anyway. Meanwhile.
We've got this here, which is the commemoration slab of John Knox, who is buried here. Now, this whole area was a graveyard because when this became a Protestant church, there was burials not allowed to happen inside the cathedral, where there would have been more before. Then this place here became the main graveyard. So underneath this tarmac is one John Knox, the leader of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland and the enemy, let's say, of Mary Queen of Scots.
And again, it goes back to this whole disrespect that Scottish people have for authority. So John Knox, one of the most famous men in the history of Scotland in terms of the Reformation, changed the country forever. And of course, his memory is marked by parking lot number 23 outside St Giles Cathedral. So it kind of goes back to that, healthy disregard for authority. Who knows where John Knox is buried now? I mean, it's a mystery. I mean, where did it go? Why did he disappear? Why did they let the remains of John Knox go?
We've got a comment from Diane saying, "Love the feisty."
Or you can't sit back and watch this going on without giving it. I mean, it's sheer shenanigans. And if you're interested in it, turn on the TV and watch this debate going on. It is just, I mean, we thought we were over this in the 1990s when we had the sleazebags that were exposed, and John Major, who was the Prime Minister then, he came out. He was a Prime Minister back in the 1990s who suffered from the sleaze, and he's come out and he's called this Prime Minister a sleazebag.
So it must be bad.
If a sleazebag is calling out another sleazebag, if it walks like a sleazebag, talks like a sleazebag, it's a sleazebag.
Now, for the question, Joe,
Yeah.
about what is this today, and I think it's still law courts.
It's all law courts.
It's a court of session, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a court of session. These are
yeah,
all individual law courts. Again, they're open to the public.
Yeah.
When I'm taking walking groups, you can go into the walking. You're not allowed to film inside at all, but you actually can go inside. It's open to the public, and I take in small groups. And inside there is a library. There's a beautiful Signet Library, which also doubles up as a champagne bar in summertime. So you can go for high tea in the library, and the lawyers are there because it's got all the historical books for all of Scots laws kept in here. But there's also a place where you go and meet your advocate before you go on trial. So you can, and you're not allowed to sit down with your brief. You have to walk with them. So they're in their robes and they've got their wigs on, and they walk in a circle. So they're not allowed to sit down. And the reason that they continually walk, is so that nobody can overhear them while you're giving confidential information back and forward. It is the old Parliament meeting place is actually in here, and the ceiling is spectacular. So if you're with us next year, you want to come to Scotland next year, and you want to come in with us, we will take you in there, because people do not go in there, and it's a little secret place that the Blue Badge guides will take you in. And we've got a good relationship with the guards in here as well, so they know that if you've got your little blue badge on, they know that you're going there. You're not allowed to take any photographs, and you have to talk in a really sotto voce, you have to really talk low. But you can go into any of the courts in here, and in fact I went into the courtroom that Joanna Cherry was in when she was doing the thing against the proroguing of Parliament a few years ago during the Brexit period. So I've been in here, and I sat in in Joanna Cherry's case.
And another thing here, and people ask me about this, is the sphinxes. But are they proper sphinxes? Not really, because they've got female heads. So they are Grecian sphinxes, if you like, and the sphinx is all tied up with the riddles and secret solutions and stuff like that. And once you solve the riddle, then you are an enlightened person. And maybe our Prime Minister needs to solve the riddle.
He'll be enlightened, I'm sorry. The day of enlightenment will come when he gets kicked out of Parliament. That's when he'll be like, or he's handcuffed and marched out of Parliament.
I love this statue. This is
this
the oldest statue in Edinburgh,
Isn't it?
if not the oldest lead equestrian statue in the whole of the UK. And it is amazing. I'll tell you a bit about the artiness of it, and then Joe will tell you about the history.
Yeah.
What it is, it depicts Charles II, who was the monarch of Scotland after Oliver Cromwell was put down, and they reverted to a monarchy, and he was much celebrated. But I'll tell you one thing, the council had a foot in both camps, because when Oliver Cromwell was winning, they were financing a statue. Oh, there we go. I'll let you hear the bells of St Giles there. They were financing a statue of Oliver Cromwell. But when Oliver Cromwell was out of the picture, then they repositioned and financed a statue of King Charles II. Now, he is depicted on this horse, and it's a lead statue, and there's not many lead statues around, and he is depicted as a Roman emperor, probably maybe about the 2nd century AD, and Marcus Aurelius is the emperor that this has been modelled on. And if you look closely, there's various details in the statue. For instance, there's no stirrups, which is quite unusual, and he's sitting on a blanket, a horse blanket, no real saddle as we would know it today. And this, of course, was all to do with stirrups weren't invented at the time of the Roman Empire. Now, the artist who was around at this time in the 17th century was called Grinling Gibbons. Now, I'm just going to walk around and let you see the detail. And he was very well known for work, especially in St Paul's Cathedral in London in the choir stalls and the architecture to have a very florid, detailed depiction of in his sculptures. So very well known as a wood sculptor. And this is extraordinary because if you look closely at the lead depiction, you can see what I mean, because there is an enormous amount of detail in there. Grinling Gibbons, it was of the school of Grinling Gibbons, and he was English, but he happened to have been brought up in the Netherlands, and he had many followers. So this is this great statue of Charles II, looking like a Roman emperor, and as you can see, he's got his staff, holding his staff there, which would have been an ebony. It would have been made of ebony with a silver top on it, and also he has got his sword. Now the sword disappeared years ago, and this statue has been repurposed, or rather restored. Let's take us around a little bit again. And if you look carefully, you can see his sword. This was in a bad way up until about 2011 when it was removed and restored because the sword was missing, and it was so heavy it was collapsing within itself, and the weight of the figure was pushing down on the horse, and the horse's legs were collapsing. So this was taken down to England, it was taken off its plinth, they got cut holes in it and took out what is called the armature or skeleton, which sculptors use if they're building up a form, and they replaced it with a steel armature to be able to support the figure as it is today. So there you go, the oldest statue in Edinburgh in lead, 1685. Now maybe Joe would like to say something about the historical connection.
Yeah, I like the idea. I like the idea that he's done up like a Roman emperor, an all-conquering Roman emperor. I mean, I love the look of it, the way he's done there. I mean, he's buff. I mean, look, it looks like he's been working out. You know, you can see his abs, you can see his pecs, looking like this. But the one thing that stands out, if you bring it across this side, Mike, because you've got a great relief here, you can actually see the Stuart nose.
You can.
It's the only thing that's really real about the Stuarts is the big nose that they all have. Every picture you see of the Stuarts, they're recognised by their huge nose that they had, the whole big conch they had on their face. But look, but he looked nothing like a Roman emperor. But if you're paying the money, as I say, if you pay the piper, you call the tune. So he's dressed up here. But this was unveiled while he was still alive.
Yeah.
But he never saw it. But the idea was that this was going to be Charles II. Now, historically, again, this is going through, Britain was going through a very tumultuous period. So his father, Charles I, had been beheaded. He'd been captured by the Scots, and this was up in the north of England, and he was handed over to the English troops during the English Civil War, and Charles I was beheaded. Now, Scots had a history of their monarchs being beheaded. Mary Queen of Scots was also beheaded. James VI wasn't. Charles I was. So the Scots went ahead and they then crowned Charles II as the King of Scots, or the King in general of the United Kingdom at the time, which went against all of Cromwell's idea. And this is what caused Cromwell to invade Scotland. And Cromwell come up and rule Scotland with an iron fist because they had the audacity to go against the New Model Army or the Republic and actually crown him as the king. So he was king. He was crowned up here before he was actually crowned in England. But he was also brought up here, and on the when he was going into exile, he was cross-examined by the Scots, and also his head was being filled with Presbyterian lectures, basically. So when he came back to the United Kingdom, though, he went on his own back onto it. So during the Restoration, he wanted to get some retribution, and so the people who were the fanatics up here, the Covenanters, he went on a bit of a rampage against the Covenanters. So we went through again a lot more bloodletting under the Restoration. The period between Charles I and Charles II was known as interregnum, so between the kings, and that was during the Republic, First Republic. The only republic, I guess, they've had here during Oliver Cromwell.
He was also known as the Merry Monarch, wasn't he?
Indeed.
and he had no legitimate children, but he had many, many illegitimate children.
And we didn't have his lover, was it Nell Gwyn? Was his...
I think she was one of them,
yeah. Many of the famous one being Nell Gwyn.
Yeah.
And it was time the Restoration. And so the theatres opened up again. People were rejoicing because during Cromwell and during the Cromwellian period, there was, everything was grey and black and white. And he came back from France, from exile, and the party started again, you know, basically. He enlightened the place in his own way, you know.
It's a good. I like the sculpture. I'm not saying I like the person who it depicts necessarily, because he'd put a terrible stamp on Scotland. But and they said that when it rained with the old sculpture, that the horse actually relieved itself. Water penetrated the inside of the horse, and it actually came out as it was peeing, let's say. But I don't know if that's absolutely true or if that's an urban myth, but no doubt about it. I just love the artistry in it, the details. So when you come to Edinburgh, come and have a look, have a close look at this and see all that very picturesque, almost carved detail. The one, what happened was there was one in Windsor, which is exact same as this one, but it was cast in bronze. And they used the same cast and cast it in lead, and then it was put here. Yeah.
And I was also heard that they've actually covered it in wax. So
they
when
have,
it does rain,
to stop.
it stops it, so protects the metal. So it's covered in wax, so it makes it more weatherproof. Just going back to the festivals, I had a question. This is from Fern last. Fern sent me an email saying, hope you get better soon. And she asked about where we're going to be celebrating Thanksgiving. But again, to our friends in the United States and in Canada, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Great Britain. It's a purely North American festival. We just don't celebrate it at all. And I know it's a big family occasion back in the States and Canada, but we don't celebrate Thanksgiving here in the UK. So we will be speaking to you before Thanksgiving, but I know preparations are. I know they've opened up now so that people who have been vaccinated can travel to the States as of today. So I know a few people who are actually flying over to the States and going to be spending some time and spending Thanksgiving with friends and family over in the United States. Let's finish off around here. We've got a couple more statues to do. But again, if you're walking around Edinburgh, this is a place to come in and have a look at. Architecture, it's really lovely. It's off the beaten track, and you're just literally 20 yards from the Royal Mile, but you get more space, and it's quieter. And you can sit in, and again, you can come and sit in here in the arches. If it's raining, if it's a shower, you can stand in the arches and just take in the grandeur of the place.
We've got a message from Marianne saying Canadian Thanksgiving was second Monday in October.
Oh, is it already gone?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Apologies. And Thanksgiving is
That's
there
Canadian,
to...
yeah.
I think Thanksgiving is there to commemorate for the early settlers. Give thanks for surviving the winter, I guess. Well, I think isn't that the story? So here we do have our harvest festival, so I think it commemorates with that as well.
So
Let's
we're
move
coming
on.
through this restricted area for parking. You can't bring a car in here unless you're connected with what's going on in the courts. But just to let you see that we're getting into the Christmas mood fairly early.
Yep.
They're getting the lights up and so on. And
There's a little cafe here. It's a nice little cafe.
we're coming to this this one. This is James Braidwood, who this sculpture was by a sculptor called Kenny Mackay. And if anybody's familiar with Glasgow public art, then he sculpted the figure of Donald Dewar, which is on Buchanan Street in Glasgow. But James Braidwood, a real important figure because he was the person who started the first municipal fire brigade in Edinburgh. He was born in 1800, and he died in about 1861. And his father was a builder and very knowledgeable about construction of buildings, and it made him able to direct his men into the proper areas to have the maximum advantage in fighting fires, which were rampant in Edinburgh leading up into the 19th century and still through the 19th century. Old buildings, clay infill, timber construction, and very close together. You can imagine how a fire would just, if it started in one building, it would go on to another. And the Great Fire of Edinburgh was in 1824, which swept down the High Street or Royal Mile. But this chap here, very much commemorated because he moved us on in our ideas about firefighting. I'll just
I mean, he didn't only start the first municipal fire brigade in Edinburgh, he started that was the first one ever in the whole of Great Britain.
In the whole of Great Britain, yeah. In fact, you can see he's holding various things. We've got a bosun's pipe. Now, a bosun's pipe was used to signal to the other firefighters when to move, where to go quickly, how to get out of the way of any danger of fallen structure or something like that. So he's known for being able to have a coded message to send to the firefighters. And you can see on his tunic there is an axe, again for cutting through debris in his whole method of fighting fires, and his helmet also, and his boots. A lot of great detail in here.
I think he came up with the concept of fire breaks as well.
Fire breaks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he then was commissioned to go down to London to start the fire brigade in London, and unfortunately he died in a fire in London.
Cooley Street, I believe, where there was warehouses beside the Thames, and suddenly the fabric of the building collapsed on top of him, and he died at the age of 61. And it was the biggest, I believe, public funeral since the Duke of Wellington, with all the people who turned out to commemorate this great man. So you've got here James Braidwood, a son of Edinburgh, and another great innovator. And the legacy of this person lasts today with modern firefighting. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the Market Cross. This is goes back. Market Cross would be the place where this is where the markets would take place. This place would have little shops here. The shops are known as Luckin booths. So lots of little shops here, and this is where you would come and buy your flour, your bread, your grain, your grass, whatever you needed here. This would be the main market, and it was always on the Market Cross where they kept the scales to weigh. So if you were going to buy stuff from a vendor, or you wanted to make sure you had the right length of cloth you're going to buy, all of the measurements that were used to measure everything against were kept here as well. And the Market Cross is also a place where they'd make public announcements. So up here they would have the gentleman would come up and go, "Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye," and he'd unscroll and he'd give all the announcements. And even today they have a tradition where if there's any royal announcement, about 3 days after the announcement is made, they open this up, the guy stands on top, he's got all of his wig and everything else on, and he stands up and he unscrolls it, because the reason it's 3 days after was because it normally took 3 days for the horses to come from London up to Edinburgh to make the announcement. So a lot of the public announcements are made from here. The plaques around it are symbolic of the different areas of Scotland and the different cities. And you can see on top we have our unicorn, symbol of Scotland, with the broken chain. And traditionally, I'm going to tell a story, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, and there's a little story that goes that if you did challenge a vendor who was selling you, say you were buying sugar, or you were buying flour, and you were buying £2 of flour, and you thought, oh wait a minute, this doesn't feel like a normal £2, you could then go and challenge and go and get the proper weight, and if they weighed it and they found out that the vendor was giving you the wrong weight, they would take the vendor and the vendor would get nailed by the ear to the Market Cross. Now this could happen in any weather, and it gets cold here in Edinburgh. So a lot of the vendors, depending how bad they were or persistent they were at under or basically cheating people, they'd be nailed by the ear and they'd be sitting there. Now it could get very cold, They could be for a day, an evening, or whatever. But there's a tendency for the vendors who had enough would actually just pull their own ears, and they would rip their own ears. And in those days, people would wear long hair, they would wear hats. So before you bought anything from a vendor, you were actually allowed to look at their ears to see if they had any scars. And this is where we get the expression rip-off, because they would rip their own ears off from the doors here. And they would go around town to town to town to town. And so if you were to make sure that you weren't buying anything from a merchant who had ripped his own ear off, or a rip-off merchant, you would check to make sure he had no scars in his ear. So this is where we get the expression rip-off merchant.
Yeah.
And there are also public floggings would take place here as well. And you do get these tours, Mike. Have you been to these tours?
Yes,
Where
yes.
they get these,
They're the ones.
You get the ones. It's usually the witches' tours. It's usually a woman who does it, and she will do she'll ask her volunteers to be publicly flogged. It's like, I would never do it on my tours. I've never done it. But you do see it. You do see these people go like, I had some wives who have volunteered their husbands for a public flogging.
Yes.
So I've seen that. But yeah, so it was used for public flogging. It was used for nailing people. I think also, going back to you mentioned Outlander. I think there's a clip in Outlander where a young boy is getting threatened to get nailed by the ear.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I believe Jamie was in Edinburgh the other day there, giving a talk about Outlander.
Oh, okay.
It's the main character. So.
Is there another series coming on?
Ah, yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so again, the wetness makes the colours stand out again. You'll see them quite well. And yeah, we'll be back. Thanks very much, Joe. I mean, he's been walking about and I've been a nervous wreck with the cobbles. And he's done so well. Thank you very much. It's, I'm sure our audience are passing on the good wishes here as well. So.